right, our first speaker is going to join us by Zoom today. It is Dr. Yi Dionne. She is a renowned American political scientist with a focus on U.S. politics, international politics, and public opinion. She earned her bachelor's degree in political science and international relations in 1999, her master's degree in 2007, and her doctorate in 2010 in political science from UCLA. From 1999 to 2003, she was an associate director of M.B.A. admissions for the UCLA Anderson School of Management, a Fulbright Scholar. She is currently a tenured associate professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside. Today, she's going to speak to us on, very appropriately, resistance in the face of threat, lessons from other democracies for navigating the Trump regime. So it's my pleasure to introduce via Zoom Dr. Dionne.
Good afternoon, everyone. Um, I have a talk for you. I'm realizing actually I should have checked this out earlier. I cannot share my screen. I do have some slides. I'm happy though to send those to you um, later in case you wanted to look at them in detail and see some of the citations that I'm talking about. But what I wanted to share was about my own research as part of a team of researchers who were studying democratic backsliding and democratic resilience. Now, this team of researchers, we were from all over the world, and we had expertise in various regions of the world. And we were funded by USAID to do this research. So, unfortunately, the kind of research we were doing is no longer being supported by the US government, but previous to the current administration taking office, let me see. Ooh, I can share my screen. Thank you so much. Um, Previous to the US, the current regime taking office, we were able to do this research to study democratic backsliding and democratic resilience. And just to put that, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page about what that means, by democratic backsliding, I mean the gradual decline in the quality of democracy through the erosion of democratic institutions, practices, and norms. And that often involves actions by elected officials or ruling parties that undermine free and fair elections, weaken checks and balances, restrict civil liberties, or concentrate power in the executive. To be clear, this is not a new definition. This is not something, people made up. This has been something that political scientists like myself have been studying for almost a decade now. Usually not in the US, right? We were studying it in other parts of the world. And so this definition of democratic backsliding comes from Nancy Bermeo's work, a Princeton University political scientist. Now, not everything is terrible. In the face of democratic backsliding, we see what we have defined as democratic resilience. And some of these sources of resilience against democratic backsliding, against presidential overreach, what political scientists call executive aggrandizement, usually involve other political institutions. So, right, this is the checks and balances, the legislature, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, or resilience can come from opposition political parties, the media, or civil society. And so, kind of based on my background in doing this study of democratic backsliding and democratic resilience, following the 2024 election, my colleagues who study American politics asked me what I thought about Trump's election. And that's because I think for people, for political scientists who study American politics, they felt a bit unprepared for understanding. Just like in the 2016 or the original election of Trump to office, they were surprised by his election in 2016. They were also surprised by his election in 2024. A lot of polls suggested that he would lose. Um, some also suggested he would win. Um, but I think that because many political scientists, just didn't expect a return to Trump, they wondered, what do people, those of us who study regimes that are less democratic, how were we interpreting this race? And as an optimist, I look to Malawi. So, for those of you who don't know about Malawi, it's a landlocked country in southeastern Africa, bordered by Zambia, Mozambique, and Tanzania. You may know it because it's the place where, as you can see in the top right corner, Madonna has adopted her children from. So maybe you've heard of some African country. This is Malawi. Or maybe you know it because this woman in the photograph holding a sword, she was the first woman president of Malawi. That's Joyce Banda. She served as president of Malawi from 2012 to 2014. She had served as vice president, but upon the unexpected in-office death of then President Bingu wa Mutharika, she ascended to the presidency to fill out the remainder of his term. So, unlike Malawi, we have not ever had a woman president, but inshallah someday. Okay, so this is where Malawi is on the map. It is a poor country. Many of its people are poor. It's poor in natural resources, but Malawi is also a relatively young country. It only achieved its independence in 1964, 1963, 1964, and really has only been a competitive democracy for the last 30 years. So um, for much of its independent period, since being since its end of colonization, it was a dictatorship. Um, but I don't know, maybe you heard this in 2020. Malawi was also the Economist Country of the Year. And so this is a screen cap from The Economist. And why they selected Malawi was because in 2020, when the rest of the world was backsliding, right? Democratic backsliding, Malawi was the one country that was actually democratizing, meaning it was moving more towards democracy and away from autocracy, right? So that's why The Economist chose it as its country of the year, and why I think it's a great place to look to for thinking about, strategies for taking back your democracy. So two takeaways I had from the 2024 election, from my perspective as a political scientist who studies comparative politics, meaning I study politics in other countries, mostly African countries, but also Malawi in particular, is that the 2024 election was really not that exceptional in voting out the incumbent. So, of course, Joe Biden did not eventually run for re-election, but if we think about the Democratic Party as the incumbent party, they were, like most incumbent political parties running in 2024 around the world, most incumbent parties lost. The other takeaway I have from the 2024 election is that, we should be concerned about Democratic backsliding, but that doesn't mean that authoritarianism is inevitable. So I think some of the, encouragements you've heard from your colleagues in your club to get you to participate in these activities, these upcoming events where it's really important that you show strong support. I think, I want to encourage you to think about that as that's your way of practicing democracy, right? Democracy is not just about elections. It's also about having the freedoms and the rights to voice how you feel about the regime on a day-to-day basis. We don't have to wait every 4 years to tell the government what we think. Um, and if we practice that kind of democracy day to day, then, authoritarianism doesn't have to be inevitable. Okay, so this is just some empirical, just showing you again, this comes from the Financial Times. In the 2024 elections, right, the US is the red dot, but every other incumbent party lost vote share in 2024. So it's really, you can talk about all the things that the Democratic Party did wrong in 2024. Um, But they had a pretty tall mountain to climb, like every other incumbent party in the world that was facing an election in 2024. I'm not saying the Democratic Party is perfect, but you know, um, they had an uphill battle. Okay, I'm going to skip this. I don't want to talk about incumbent advantages or other losers. I do want to share this graphic with you from VDEM. So if you've never heard of VDEM before, they that stands for Varieties of Democracy. And VDEM has an online website that you can use to look at what what democracy looks like around the world and over time. And actually, if you did look at what VDEM was saying about democracies, you would not be surprised to learn that they're not blind to what's happening in the US right now. So this graphic is to just show you that there is democratic backsliding happening as we speak across many countries in the world today. Um, the global democratic backsliding is real. Quantifiably, based on these expert surveys, these excellent expert surveys that VDEM does every year, kind of surveying political scientists who have expertise in specific countries, how specific countries are doing on dozens of metrics. So it's not just like, does it feel like a democracy to you? Like, it's not about vibes, right? It's specific questions. Do do people have like is the universal franchise truly universal? Um, does the opposition party have the same access to media time in campaigning for elections, right? These kind of very specific questions that then get aggregated into an overall measure of democracy. And it's this information that VDEM uses to show us that there's democratic backsliding globally. But also, if you go to their website, you can see some of their more recent short pieces, quick takes that they've done, demonstrating that actually the US is also going through democratic backsliding at the moment. So again, if you're at, I don't know, Thanksgiving dinner in a couple of months, and you have family members who are like, oh, that's just fake news, left-wing media, you can say, no, it's actually like grounded in empirical fact. There are political scientists all around the world who have been asked these questions, and you can show them, VDEM graphs and data. I don't know what your family is like at Thanksgiving, but sometimes these things can be helpful when I'm trying to talk to people who are on the other side, or maybe not even on the other side of the aisle, but are somewhere in the middle. Maybe they're apathetic, but when I show them information like this and speak about it in a way that's calm, which is very difficult for me to do these days, but when I can muster up the strength and courage to do that, this kind of information can be helpful. Okay, so recent events in the US are consistent with backsliding, or what political scientists call autocratization. Um, and that's just an empirical fact. That's not a partisan take. So here's what I've learned from attempted autocratizations in Malawi, the country that I've studied closely. Um, Let me be specific. There were three autocratizing events. Um, the first one, I think, is the one we all should be most concerned about. So in 2002, then President Bikili Muluzi began attempts to try to change the rules in Malawi so that he could run for a third term in office. Now, Malawi's constitution forbids that. It says you cannot hold more than two terms as president. So Bikili Maluzi was changing the composition of what would be similar to our U.S. House of Representatives. He was changing the composition of their Congress such that he would have a sufficient quorum and a supermajority to pass a constitutional amendment so that he could run for a third term. Now, those attempts were thwarted, um, but it came really close. The fact that he even had the wherewithal to attempt to make the change was really threatening to Malawi's democracy. And some of the things that he did during that autocratizing event actually rolled back democracy in Malawi, eroded some of the democratic institutions. Then, he leaves, he's unsuccessful. He actually handpicks his successor, President Binguwa Mutharika, and during Mutharika's second term in office in 2011, he engages in violent repression and silencing the opposition and silencing the media. He was reducing the powers of the judiciary. Um, Thugs representing his party were engaging in targeted violence against leaders of the opposition or human rights defenders. And then, in fact, there was this massive protest in July 2011, where police were using live rounds to fire upon protesters. So, in addition to using things like tear gas and nullifying permits to participate in protests, Mutharika's government also engaged in violent repression of the protests, leaving dozens of people injured and at least 20 people killed in the protests, killed by the state, right? Killed by police. Um, so we see that happening during Mutharika's presidency, but then shortly thereafter, we see another autocratization event when he dies in office. Actually, um, his um, his cabal attempted to subvert the constitutional succession of president after death in office. This is unfortunately another thing I think we in the U.S. should be concerned about is now, the Constitution in Malawi and the Constitution in the United States, both of those constitutions and many other constitutions in the world have provisions for what we do when a president dies in office. Those constitutions in Malawi and in the US also have provisions for what we do when a president is incapacitated, is in ill health. Um, and while those institutions exist, right? And, Malawi is actually very similar to the US. If you read that part of the Constitution, it almost reads exactly like the amendment in the US Constitution for, how we deal with presidential succession. Um, but um, what we've learned from the Malawi case and from actually, I've done a study on all African countries in the instance of death in office or ill health in office in Africa. And um, constitutions are great. They don't always work. They are not always followed. And um, so for the US case, the thing I want to just make sure that people are aware of and are mindful of is that death in office is most likely to trigger a constitutional succession, but ill health in office is actually not. And part of that is because, uh, and again, I see parallels between Malawi in 2012 to the US in 2025, is that even if the vice president has nominal power, um, the president actually gives power to personal connections and not necessarily to institutional expectations. And those people who are personally connected to the president stand to lose the most if he's incapacitated or dies. And if those people have any sort of power, they can subvert the constitutional succession, whether that's for incapacitation or death in office. And those are just things that I think people should be thinking about, prepared for, and vocal about what the expectations will be should that happen. Okay, so we had these three major autocratizing events. What kept Malawi from turning back to authoritarianism from what they experienced from the 1960s to the 1990s? And there were two key parts to that. One was the independent judiciary, the courts, and the second was civil society. Those were really key for resisting democratic backsliding, whether it was the courts ruling against the president. And that's not just the Supreme Court or the High Court, as they call it in Malawi, but also lower courts feeling the independence and the strength to rule in opposition to the ruling party. Um, I'm not so sure we're going to see very much of that at the upper levels, given that the current Supreme Court seems to be deciding very close, in favor of the Trump administration in many cases. That I still think that there's some room there, though, for resisting autocratization in the U.S. I think especially the work that's been done by organizations like Democracy Forward and others that are trying to resist. I think certain institutions that are also trying to resist. So I work for the University of California at Riverside, and the University of California itself, the Office of the President has done some limited legal action against the Trump administration. For example, they canceled one of I'm a co-investigator on a National Endowment for the Humanities grant that was originally canceled in April, but through a court case has been reinstated. And so I think legal action can be one way to resist democratic backsliding. Um, I think that Malawi's ability to do that was a bit stronger because of how much more independent their highest courts were than the current Supreme Court of the US. I think does not quite have the same amount of independence. Now, some other favorable conditions or institutions for resisting democratic backsliding in Malawi were a military that was also independent and professionalized. Um, Again, I'm not as confident in the independence and separation of civil military relations in the U.S. today as I am in Malawi's civil military relations. I think that the U.S. And I think this has been part of the strategy for building cabinets in both the first Trump administration and the current administration. So I don't know that the U.S. military is going to be um, um, as effective, I think, as the Malawi military was. But other groups that also played some important roles were mainstream religious groups, the media, and the legislature. Now, Malawi's media is not independent. It does depend a lot on the government, and the legislature has rarely shown independence in Malawi. But even though the media and the legislature in Malawi were partially captured by the ruling party, they still would sometimes show independence from the presidency. And so, you know, I'm not in love with what's happening in the media these days. The decision to cancel Jimmy Kimmel is not a good sign for media independence, right? All of these this conglomeration of media companies, and then their reliance on the FCC in the US for being able to broadcast. A lot of that has made them less independent in this current Trump administration. Um, but that doesn't mean that they can't still have some potential for resisting backsliding because again, in Malawi, the media is not independent, but there are still glimmers, there's still windows of opportunity. Same with the legislature. Of course, the current legislature favors the ruling party here in the United States. But again, there's still going to be moments where Democrats and even some potential Republicans, I can't rule it out, are going to resist autocratization. It's, I think, becoming less likely among Republicans. Some other things that actually, I put favorable in quotes here is Malawi's economy is quite poor. And it was those poor economic conditions that sustained civil society protests. So I'm not saying that I would really like us to have a poor economy, but I am saying that, people being unable to meet their basic needs, that can often really push them to participate in democratic action. At least in the Malawi case, it was a pretty strong predictor of that. So I can go on about how Malawi's judiciary saved democracy, but I won't bore you with the details there. Just trust that that happened. If you want to learn more about it, I'll also email a copy of some copies of some articles that I've written that can give some more detail if you're interested. I do want to focus a bit on civil society because I think, you know, if you want to think about what ordinary citizens can do to resist democratic backsliding, I think Malawi civil society is a really great example of that. Um, now, you know, I think the calling on mass protests is a really powerful check on presidential power. Um, and what I'll say is um, Malawi's courts have been independent, but their most um, challenging actions, right? The decisions that they've made that have checked the president the strongest have always been decided after mass civil protests. So, and that's because the judiciary can see with their own eyes what's happening in the streets. And so, even though, like, political scientists like me who study Malawi praise the judiciary for their independence, we also recognize that that independence is contextual, right? And so, as you know, as regular people, you and I, one of the most important things we can do is take to the streets, and those actions um, are, they build community with you and everyone who's there, but they also serve as a really strong signal, right, to the judiciary, to the legislature, that were they to challenge presidential power, they wouldn't be doing it alone. That there are people calling on them to do this because everyone knows that protesting is actually a high risk activity that requires a lot of um, there's a lot of costs associated with participating. It's much harder to do than voting, right? And the other political actions we can take, it's harder to do than posting something on Facebook or Instagram or, whatever social media platform that you use. Um, it's, taking your physical body out to the streets. And in some cases, um, you know, running the risk of counter protesters, agitating against you, and that's no small risk. I think, especially given what we've seen since Trump was originally elected in 2016. So I don't know if you're familiar with Erica Chenoweth's work. So Erica Chenoweth is a political scientist who works at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she's written a number of books about nonviolent civil resistance. She has a book called titled "Nonviolent Civil Resistance Works." That book is a bit technical, but this book, Civil Resistance: What Everyone Needs to Know, that I have in the slides here, it's actually geared towards a general reader who's just interested in understanding how civil resistance works, why it's successful, why you don't need violence to have a revolution, and how sustained democratic rule is actually much more likely when you have nonviolent civil resistance that leads to a change in power. Um, and Erica Chenoweth continues this work with her colleagues, collecting crowdsourced information about participation in protests. And they've been doing this crowd counting consortium, uh, counting protest crowds in the United States since actually the inauguration of Trump in the first Trump administration in 2017. And they wrote an article just last month about how the No Kings protest was one of the largest days of protest in US history. We're not talking recent history, right? We're talking because Erica Chenoweth has been studying civil resistance since before the civil rights movement, right? So, kind of looking at data from even going back to the 1960s, right? Um, she and her colleagues show that the Black Lives Matter protests were actually quite large in 2020 during many COVID lockdowns, but also that this most recent No Kings protests was historic in the number of people who came out on the streets. And I think the upcoming protests are likely to even break those records. But that, of course, would depend on, again, ordinary people like you and me taking to the streets, encouraging other people to come. And that is something that, again, like if you read Erica Chenoweth's work, you'll see some of the strategies as well to get people to come. So, one thing that I've learned in organizing is, doing it through institutions like this one that you're all meeting with today, whether in person or online, but also by taking 2 to 3 new people to the protest. So people who haven't ever gone and bringing them with you, helping them make a sign and bring it to the protest. That brings them into community and that increases the numbers and that makes it more likely for them to participate in mass actions in the future as well. So I'm going to leave it there. My email address is kdionne@ucr.edu. Like I said, I'll send these slides as well as a couple of papers I've written about Malawi, so that they can be shared with you if you have further questions. So of course, I encourage you to email me. I'd be happy to answer them. So those are all the slides that I have, but I'm happy to answer questions as best I can. Um,
Well,
if
thank
anyone
you.
has
Thank you
any.
very much. And we do have a little time for a few final minutes. And your presentation was right on point as to the challenges that we had. An individual that came to last month's meeting and it was his first meeting and he said he was at the meeting because he's just pissed off. And we need to channel that being pissed off into showing up, right? And I really appreciated your message today. Do we have any questions for Dr. Dionne? Go ahead in the back of the room.
This is Dr. Dionne. I had a question regarding case studies in Africa and how like media plays in. I know like with regards to okay, thank you. Okay. With regards to polarization in media, I guess in like misinformation, I on the way here I talked to my neighbor who happens to be older. He brought up Charlie Kirk and happened to get in a conversation. He was like, it's just horrible what people are saying about Charlie Kirk. And I was like, well, he mentioned that, Joe Biden should not only be arrested but put to death and we should have public executions. He's like, well, I've never heard anything about that. And, a lot of this is, propaganda and information driven. And, in the modern society, we are, to a certain extent, the petri dish of that, with, foreign adversaries and everything. And I just wonder how much does that play in, because that's kind of the underlying ties of authoritarianism.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think misinformation and disinformation are actually common in African countries as well. And like in the US, Russia plays a major role in disinformation campaigns in African countries. And so not that, they're the only ones involved, but they are, there's recent political science research that shows actually that Russia is quite involved in many disinformation campaigns related to politics and otherwise in a range of countries. In Malawi and other African countries, it's usually through different channels. So, the most common social media platform that people use there is WhatsApp. And WhatsApp is interesting because it's a private messaging service, and so it's different in that you can't even see what other people are seeing and liking. You just know who's in your group and what's being shared. And so I actually think that that's an even more dangerous social media platform because you can get information and you're not even sure, if other people are getting that same information and whether they're finding that information credible. So bad as our media environment is in the United States right now, it could be worse. So I think the extent to which, you can try to share reputable information, because I think, Democrats also share misinformation. Democrats also share polarizing images and polarizing claims. And I think that I do not want to minimize the polarization that's happened in the United States. That a lot of the polarization is not because the Democrats have moved left and the Republicans have moved right. It's because the Republicans have moved right, right? And political scientists have done research showing this too, that like the extremism is actually happening from one side of the aisle. And actually, Democrats are moving more center. Um, there are some splinters, right? We see some people who are moving left, but the tendency is actually not moved very much in the Democratic Party. Um, However, it's still incumbent upon all of us, whatever your partisan affiliations are, or if you have no partisan affiliation, to be critical and mindful of the information that we consume and the information that we share. Um, I maintain friendships with people who have different politics from me because it's important to me that they have friends who see things differently from them. Even if I fundamentally disagree with them on a lot of things that are really important to me. For example, my mother is an immigrant, so I have really strong feelings about immigration and ICE. Um, and they're the party in power. They're the party in power, right? And so I they're the ones who are actually going to be able to change things. And so I need them to think differently. So it's not just um, what I want my friends to believe, but I actually need to keep those conversations. And part of that is, I live in Riverside County, which half of whom voted for Trump. And in my neighborhood, there were plenty of Trump signs.
Yeah.
And I think being in community with people who are not like you can help, right? So I think you spending time with this elderly person who is just consuming different media than you and patiently, kindly engaging with them is a way to minimize the potential effect that that mis and disinformation can do.
Dr. Dionne, we do need to get to our Senate candidates, but first we'd like to have at least one more question. Go ahead,
Sure.
and I'll open my note.
There was an article just to what you were saying in the Washington Post this morning about a gentleman who was trying to retire with benefits from a government job and could not get the benefits as his wife was dying. So,
Any questions in the
and
chat?
he still would vote for Trump again. Anyway, my question is, it's great when we have a lot of people at the rallies here in Torrance and wherever else. It blows my mind that there aren't 10 times the number of people out on the streets. And in other places where they do strikes and the country comes to a grinding halt, and I cannot believe we are not doing that at this point. My question is, does it matter? Is it positive, negative, or just inconsequential when we are doing these rallies?
It absolutely matters. It absolutely matters. I cannot stress it enough. It's really important. And I think, how do we get more people? It's not something that we always practice in the United States. And part of that is like a complacency that we've been able to kind of just, everything's been fine for us. For many of us, I shouldn't say for all of us, but for many of us, everything's been fine for 30, 40, 50 years. And so we haven't felt the need to protest. And so we don't have any practice. And I think that, this is again why it's really important to bring new people in. So get your regulars, but say, make a commitment, with your friend group and say, all of us, we have to commit to bring two new people. I think when you have, when you commit with a friend group to, I'm going to bring two new people, that's going to it's going to be big. And those two people who you bring might be more comfortable if they bring a friend of theirs, right? And so the numbers really do matter. And I think that, I think that even if the president doesn't care, and even if the people around him are going to give him numbers that are going to make him feel like it's small, he's not the only person who's watching what's happening on the streets. Like I said, I think the other less independent, kind of fearful political institutions will see that and know maybe that will make them a little bit braver than they were previously.
Dionne, we have one last question, and I can see it's from a gentleman named Roger Schlamp.
Yeah. My question is that early on in your talk, you talked about how worldwide incumbents lost in the election. And in your research, what reasons did you find for that?
Yeah, so typically incumbents lose because the economy's bad. That's true globally. And in the US in particular, the incumbents lose when the economy is bad. Now, the challenge is sometimes the economy is just fine, but the media reports on it like it's bad, right? So it's less about the reality and more about the perceptions. But in 2024, there were some economic indicators that were poor. th- the other reasons why incumbents lose is because they don't deliver on their promises, right? So I was around when George Herbert Walker Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then he made new taxes and people voted him out, right? So these, sometimes it's for breaking promises. I'm not sure, I think in the case of Trump, right, he's constitutionally limited and should not be eligible to run. But in these former elections in 2024, a lot of the incumbents lost because of economic challenges. And those economic challenges led to the rise of some far right parties in various countries around the world. And those far right parties took enough vote share, and the people that they were taking vote share from was largely from centrist or leftist parties.
Thank you.
We have two questions online, but do we need to move on?
Can we do maybe one question online and then we'll move to part 2 of our agenda today, Reggie?
Okay, go ahead and let Wally to ask his question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the opportunity. I can see, I would like you to personally speculate, not science, but just opinion. I can see kind of three scenarios that are potentially what we're going to deal with. One is that uh, Trump's lies, he's incompetent. So the decisions he's making with the economy are going to forget what the polls and the data say. People are going to be affected by this. They're already being affected, but the layoffs and the terrible tariffs and all that kind of thing. So there's going to be some real upset. Do you think, you personally think that the Republican Congress will wake up and deal with the fear they experience with his threats? Do you think, or the American military will step in and simply remove him from office in a military coup? Because he may have stacked the upper echelon, but it's the rank and file that have to follow this. Or third, that there is no hope, and basically he's going to continue with his nonsense
I,
indefinitely. So,
yeah,
what's your personal opinion?
of those three options, I think three is the most likely. I don't think that I certainly don't think that there's going to be a military coup against President Trump. I think we're much more, if we were to see something like that, we were much more likely to see something called an autogolpe, a self coup, right? Where something like a January 6th, right? Where Trump will use the military to stay in office, right? That is more likely than a standard military coup, where they unseat Trump. Um, I think that people are going to feel the pain of poor economic governance. Um, I think it's harder for Republican Party elected officials to go against Trump. Um, and that's just because, especially maybe after the midterm elections, because then they won't be primaried out. Because he wields so much influence with the Republican voters that I think it's unlikely that elected officials would go against him for fear of being primaried. I don't think we're going to see that happening. I think much more likely is that he'll continue to govern. Now, how he governs, I think, can be affected by the extent to which ordinary Americans take to the streets. I also think that, there's other potential variables, right? And I've talked about some of these like ill health and incapacitation of the president. I think those are also things that regular rank and file Democrats need to think about what they expect from their leadership. And I think the messaging around, how to counter Trump, I think rank and file Democrats need to speak to their leadership about what they want their leaders to do in kind of the rhetorical countering of Trump that makes space for them to do things like win back the Senate and the House in the midterms. Those are hard things to do, but and again, like I think, as you were saying at the top of the lineup, right, talking about these 5 seats, those 5 seats are really going to make a big difference. You might think it's just 5 seats. What does it matter? It really is going to make a difference, because I think it's going to be quite close. And his ability to govern and to push his legislation is really going to depend on whether he has a majority and how slim that majority is. So the midterms, so these street protests are important, and the midterm elections are really important. And our ability to like really have competitive elections and to be vigilant about how those elections need to be competitive and that people need to have the ability to vote, that's something that's worth taking to the streets for.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dionne.
Thank you all for your attention and time. I really appreciate it. Have a
I
great rest
hope
of the
maybe
meeting.
next year we can maybe have you back and we'll see the increase in democracies on the rise instead of contracting. But
I love that. And I'll be
that's
there in person next year. That's what we'll do. I'll drive out to Palos Verdes. It'll be a
all
good
right.
time.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
And I'll tell you the message that I'm hearing is, and I've said this before at our meetings, no one's going to ride in on a white horse and say it's up to us.